Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about methods and strings. So this was the homework from last time, and the homework was to prompt the user to enter 5 names and then store them in an array, and then use a for loop to find the word that comes first alphabetically. You can feel free to pause it here and then compare it to your answer, but I'm just going to go over it super briefly. So first we initiated a scanner, which allows the user to input things. And then we initialized a string array of 5 indexes because we only needed 5 names. Then we created a for loop, which looped through the array and asked the user each time to enter something. And then we created a first name string, which stored the word that came first alphabetically. And then we looped through the array again and compared the names I to the first name, and if it was less in the alphabetical order, then we switched the first name variable and names I, meaning that the first name always stored the word that came first alphabetically, and then at the very end we printed out everything plus first name. So the name that comes first alphabetically is, and then the first name variable. If you're confused about what the Compareto method is, you can always feel free to look that up and check the Java documentation. It's always super in-depth, but essentially Compareto just returns a integer, which is negative or positive based on whether the names or the words that they're comparing it to, the strings that they're comparing it to, are less than or greater to alphabetically. But always feel free to look up and look at the Java documentation because it's super helpful. So getting into methods. So methods are essentially smaller programs within your big program. For example, this method right here, it's converting centimeters to meters, and it takes in centimeters, which the user of the method is able to enter it in. This is called a parameter. We'll go over that more later. But basically, all this method's doing, as you can see, is just dividing centimeters by 100 to turn it into meters, and then returning the meters. So there are 2 types of methods. There's a function type method, which returns something, and then there's a procedure type method, which doesn't return anything. So defining and invoking methods. Basically, this entire top part is something called a method header, and every time you create a method, you're always going to need to have a method header. This is what the computer looks for whenever you're making a method, and it's how it's going to know that this is a method. So these are the modifiers, public and static. You're not supposed to know what those are right now, so don't worry about them. However, just know that most of the time for now, when we're doing methods, you're going to use public static. So this return value type we already talked about. It can be anything. It can be string, int, double. And then we have the method name. And the method name can be whatever you want. Just like variables, you can name the method anything. So in this case, we named it max, but last time we named it c to m. You can name it a, you can name it z. Anything would work, and it doesn't have an effect on your program. And then these are the parameters. And what parameters basically do is they take an input from where the method is called, and they store certain values so that you can use them later in your method. So for example, when we called this method max, we used the predetermined or predefined variables in this program, x and y, but those could also be like 3 and 2 or any sort of integer. But these x and y, these are just used for example. So this x is passed to num1, and then this y is passed to num2. So if x was 3, then num1 would be 3, and then if y was 4, num2 would be 4. And then those values persist all throughout this method. And then at the very end, you return the result, or you return an integer, because that's the return type value. And the values x and y are not affected outside of the method. So if they were 4 and 3, and then we subtracted x from 2 and made it 1, then x would not become 1 in the main function, but it would stay 3. It's just that inside this method here, this parameter would become 1. So whenever you reference num1, it would be 1, but whenever you reference x, it would always be 3. So some advantages to methods. it makes the code more organized and easier to reuse code. And it's also very easy to divide work. And when we get into debugging and you have bigger programs, it makes it much easier to debug them. Also, when you're coding, you typically don't want to have to do this sort of calculation hundreds of times if you're doing a lot of like centimeter to meter conversion for some reason. So you wouldn't want to type out int meters, meters equals centimeters divided by 100, like 20 different times. If you're using that same function, you would just create a method for it and then use it again. So passing by primitive and passing by object. So we got into objects a little bit last time when we talked about arrays. And you might not have heard this word exactly, object, but just know that an array is an object. We'll get more into objects later. But basically, when we pass by a primitive type, like an integer or a character or a float or a double, we're passing a copy of that value into the parameter. And then that copy can be changed inside the method, but is not changed in the main method, which is what I referenced earlier when I said the like 3 minus 2 thing. So any changes that you make to the parameter that was passed, those aren't reflected in the main method itself. And then when we pass by object, it's actually quite different. So say instead of an integer over here, we passed an entire array. So we passed an integer array instead of an integer. When we make changes inside with the integer array, it's actually completely reflected outside. And this is because of the way that the memory is referenced throughout the program, because arrays are something called an object type, and those are referenced differently than integers, which are something called a primitive type. So just know that whenever you make changes to an object type inside your method, those changes are reflected in your main method. However, whenever you make changes to a primitive type parameter inside your method, those changes are not reflected. And that's a very important distinction to make, especially if you're getting into coding like larger programs. So Java actually provides a lot of different methods and classes to do certain functions for us. It actually helps us a lot when it comes to that. So one of the most common ones that you're going to use is random number generation. And just like we import java.util at the beginning of every program, for example, over here we did java.util at the top, we're going to import java.lang.math. And then the pattern to generate a random number would be max minus min plus 1, and that's all plus min. That might be a bit confusing now, but it'll make sense later. So the min value is inclusive while the max value is exclusive. So we add 1 to the max. And then the function itself returns a double, so we need to cast that to an integer, which is what these parentheses are. So if you want to cast a value to another value, use parentheses. And so this one, it generates a random number between 1 and 100 because it's times 100 plus 1. So it would be 1 and 100 is the range. And then the random method. This is also in the random class. And then we would have to import java.util.random for this one. To generate a random number in the specified range, we need to do random.nextInt, and then the parameter would be max plus min. And then so over here, this one would generate a random number between 100 and 0. Okay, so moving on to the homework. So for this homework, if you want, you can write a method in Java to check whether a string is a valid password or not. So the rules are a password must have at least 10 characters. It must consist of only letters and digits, and it must contain at least 2 digits. So to do this, we would need to use methods to check for different patterns and to loop through the array that you're going to have and check whether it's valid or not. And then you can also check out dmodge for different practice problems, and the link would be in the description. Okay, so now we're going to go over a really quick coding example. So say we want to design a program that checks if any given year is a leap year, and we want to use functions for this. So first we're going to try it using the return type function. And remember, this function returns something, so the keyword is not void. For this function, I'm going to use a Boolean because we want to check whether it is a leap year or not a leap year. So we can use the keywords true and false to determine whether it is or not. So is leap year int year, and I'm doing this outside of my main function because methods can never go inside other methods, and the main function counts as a method. So we're going to do if year, which is the parameter that we gave ourselves, if year modulus 4 equals 0. And if you guys don't remember what modulus is, that's basically dividing the year and then dividing the numbers together and then getting the remainder. So if year is divisible by 4, then it'll return 0, and that's what a leap year is, right? So we want return true for that, and then else return false. Often you don't want the return statements inside of if and else statements, so I'm just going to use something called a flag. I'm just using a helper variable for this. Oops. So I'm just going to make this flag equals true, and then flag equals false. And technically we don't really need this condition because it's already set to false, but I'm just going to keep it there for readability. Then we're going to have return flag. So this returns the leap year, or whether it is or not a leap year. So in our main function, we're going to call this method that we just made. So I'm going to create a scanner system.in, and remember this takes the input from the user. Then I'm going to create the year, which is going to call this input and ask the user to input something. So I'm just going to be like system.out.println. Oops. Input a year. And then over here we're going to do if is leap year year. So we're passing that variable that we just made equals true. System.out.println. Oops. Can't type today. Year is a leap year. And then, because there are only two conditions, true or false, so I don't really need to do an else if, I can just do an else. System.out.println year is not a leap year. So remember, when we call the function, it's going to return either true or false because the flag is either true or false. So we're going to pass this year that the user just inputted to this function, check whether it's true or false, return whether it's true or false, and then check this if-else statement and print something out. So we can run this function and try it to make sure it works. Input a year. Let's input 2020. So 2020 is a leap year. But then we can run it again, and we can try 2019. And 2019 is not a leap year. So as you can see, that function works for now. But we also learned two types of functions, right? So we have return type for this one. Let's say we wanted to do a procedure type. So I'm going to create an entirely different function for this one. I'm going to call it public static void. Remember, this has to be void because it's not returning anything. Void is leap year, and then I'm just going to do I'm going to do is leap year pro for procedure, and then int year. So we're going to basically do the same thing over here, except we're going to be checking. sorry, we're basically going to do the same thing, except we're not going to be returning anything. So we don't need the Boolean flag. And remember, in procedure type functions, we're not returning anything, and we're basically doing everything from this function itself. So we can just take this over here instead of printing it in our main function, and we can do year is a leap year. Same thing over here, year is not a leap year. So we're basically printing from our function itself, and we don't need to call that from the main function. Remember, procedure type and return type functions have different uses, and they're useful in different scenarios. So we're just using both over here just to just as example. So we made the year, and then we're just going to call is leap year. You don't need to link your methods to any variable. You can just call it. So we're doing is leap year year, is leap year pro year. And if we call this right now, it's going to ask us to input another year. So we're just going to do 2020 again. As you can see, 2020 is a leap year. Just to make sure that everything's working right and we're not accidentally calling the other method, I'm just going to comment this whole thing out. Remember, guys, you can comment entire blocks of code out if you use / star and then star and backslash where you want to end it. Slash is commenting the entire block out. So we're going to run it again. Is leap year pro. Input a year 2019. 2019 is not a leap year. And remember, if you wanted to run this function over and over again until the user said stop, you can just make a while loop and then ask the user if they want to keep going. You don't always need to just make it go once and then have to keep running it. So there are always different ways to approach that.